The debt of flesh. She arrived as compensation for a debt, a soul offered as bitter mockery beneath a sky the shade of iron and sorrow. Her identity, they informed him, was simply the Oriental woman, a piece of human merchandise negotiated over a liquor-stained table in a settlement called Providence that had abandoned all meaning of its name. Elias observed her from his isolated ranch's veranda, a figure of anguish silhouetted against the plain's harsh vastness. She appeared diminutive, restrained not by bonds, but by weariness so complete it seemed to root her to the earth. The man who brought her, Silas, possessed laughter like grinding gravel. A companion for the widower, he had mocked, his words a slick sermon on practical virtues. Warms the bed. Quieter than your previous one, I'd wager. The reference to Sarah, his departed wife, was a calculated barb aimed at the tenderest part of Elias's anguish. He refused the provocation. His features, carved into stoic composure by sun and grief, revealed nothing. He simply watched Silas depart, abandoning the woman beside a single, pitiful traveling case. The arrangement. Elias was a man of sparse speech, his heart a sealed chamber since Sarah's fever claimed her 2 years earlier. The quiet she left behind was tangible, a burden that had descended over the homestead, stifling his 2 young children's joy, Caleb and Leah, and killing the flowers she had tenderly cultivated. Now this fresh silence, this new woman, stood before him. He was decent, principled, and the concept of accepting this human currency sickened him. Yet abandoning her to the prairie's cruelty, or worse, to someone like Silas, would be greater transgression. He descended the steps, his boots stirring small clouds of rust-colored dust. He halted several feet away. She never raised her eyes, her gaze locked on his porch's splintered boards, as though they were the only stability in a world that had crumbled beneath her. He was substantial, made larger by the isolation he wore like armor. Inside the dwelling, 2 small faces, miniature versions of his guarded expression, watched through grimy glass. His children provided another reason he couldn't turn her away. He cleared his throat, the sound harsh in the still atmosphere. He indicated not his own entrance, but the small chamber adjoining the main structure, one that had housed a farmhand years ago. There, he said. It wasn't an invitation, it was a declaration of boundaries. Then he pivoted and walked inside, the screen doors slam his only offered conversation. The ghost in the house. The initial week became an exercise in mutual haunting. Mai, as she would eventually be known, moved through his world's periphery like a specter. She occupied the small, austere room he'd designated, a space containing little beyond a cot and a crate for furniture. She never entered the main dwelling unless he was absent, working distant boundaries. Then she would slip in, a phantom of efficiency, cleansing the dust layers that had sanctified his sorrow, washing the children's garments and leaving them folded as silent, anonymous offerings. Elias would return to find lye soap's scent where only stale grief had lingered, a hint of order amid his neglect's chaos. He and the children consumed their meals in tense quiet at the main table. He would place a dish for her on the porch rail, and by morning it would vanish. The plate cleaned and returned to the identical spot. They were phantoms sharing the same house, orbiting a core of mutual loneliness they never acknowledged. The children, Caleb and Leah, became her silent watchers. They observed her from behind the barn, their wide, solemn eyes tracking her movements. She never approached them, never offered smiles or words. She respected their fear, the fierce devotion they held for their mother's memory. She understood barriers. Her own were constructed of something far stronger than timber and stone. The garden's Calhoun afternoon. Elias watched through the window as she stood before the skeletal remnants of Sarah's rose garden. It was earth defined by thorns and death, a perfect monument to his withered heart. He hadn't touched it since Sarah's passing, couldn't bear to. But Mai stood there extensively, her small frame motionless against the relentless wind. She wasn't examining the dead bushes but the soil itself, her head tilted as if hearing a story only she could perceive. He felt sharp, protective anger. That was Sarah's sacred ground. He expected her to retreat, but she didn't. Instead, she knelt, her hands hovering over the cracked, unforgiving dirt. For a moment he thought she might weep. The alien concept unsettled him, but she didn't weep. She simply remained there, a sentinel at a stranger's love's grave. The next morning she began working. With bare hands, she started removing brittle weeds, her movements slow and deliberate. Elias watched distantly, his grip tightening on his axe handle. Every weed she pulled felt like violation, disturbance of sacred ruin. He told himself he should stop her, order her to leave it untouched, that some things were meant to remain broken. Yet he remained silent, imprisoned by his own inertia. The children watched too, their initial suspicion slowly transforming into quiet curiosity. They saw what he saw. She wasn't destroying the garden's memory. She was performing last rites, clearing the dead things with reverence that disarmed his anger, arranging them neatly aside. Then she began turning the soil using a sharpened metal scrap she must have discovered in the barn. The labor was grueling, the ground iron hard. Yet she persisted daily under the merciless sun. She wasn't merely clearing land. She was excavating hope from absolute despair. It was a language he understood better than words, the language of relentless, thankless toil, of battling indifferent earth and wresting from it reason to continue. The silent understanding. He saw perspiration on her brow, dirt ground deep into her hands' lines, and for the first time perceived not the Chinese girl, or a burden, but a fellow survivor. One evening, he discovered one of his work shirts carefully placed on his bed, his favorite, fabric worn thin at the elbows. It had been torn on barbed wire. He'd intended discarding it, but she had taken it. The tear wasn't merely patched. It was mended with fine, intricate stitchwork he'd never seen before. In the patch's center, woven with thread she must have unraveled from her meager possessions, was a small, delicate embroidery of a mountain blossom. It was exquisitely beautiful, a tiny, defiant act of creation on Decay's canvas. He ran his calloused thumb over the threads. It was a message. I am more than a beast of burden. I have skill. I have a name. I have a past. He wore the shirt the following day, and though he didn't acknowledge her work, he felt her gaze on the mended cloth, a fleeting, almost imperceptible connection. The soil began softening under her care. The earth, long barren, started breathing again. Elias found himself altering his daily path home just to pass the garden, witnessing the slow, miraculous transformation. He told himself it was foolish. Nothing would grow there again. But part of him, a part he thought long dead, felt anticipation's flicker. He began leaving fresh well water near the plot each morning before riding out. He never saw her use it, but the water disappeared each evening, the soil dark and moist. It was silent conversation, shared stewardship of this small, hopeful earth square. Breaking barriers, the children were first to cross the invisible boundary. One sweltering afternoon as she worked, Leah, his daughter, walked tentatively toward the garden. She stopped several feet away, clutching something in her small fist. For long moments, she simply stood there, a small, brave soldier. Then she opened her hand and extended a rusty, forgotten trowel, one of Sarah's old tools she must have unearthed. She didn't speak, simply offered it. Mai ceased her work and looked at the child, then at the tool. She slowly wiped her hands on her trousers and accepted the trowel, her fingers brushing Leah's for a fleeting second. It was their first touch. Caleb, ever his father's shadow, emerged from behind the water trough, holding dried seeds he'd found in a shed. He too offered them to her. She accepted them with solemn nod, a flicker of something soft and vulnerable in her eyes. That evening, the house's atmosphere felt different. The silence was less oppressive, less heavy. Elias served the stew in familiar, quiet ritual. But this time it was broken. Her voice, when it came, was quiet but filled the entire room, low and clear without trace of the servitude he'd expected. "My name," she said, looking directly at him for the first time. Her gaze steady and unbroken, "is Mai." He froze, spoon halfway to his mouth. The word hung in the air, substantial and weighty. It wasn't a plea, it was a declaration, a reclamation. In that single moment, she ceased being the Chinese girl, the ghost, the burden. She became a person with a name and will that had survived the inferno. He felt profound, unnerving shift inside him, as if a foundation stone had been dislodged. He didn't reply with words, but the next day, passing her in the yard, he gave a stiff, almost imperceptible nod and said, "Mai." The name felt foreign and strange on his tongue, but it also felt right, like the beginning of an amends. New Rhythm's life on the ranch found new rhythm. quiet harmony orchestrated by unspoken agreements. Mai began eating with them at the table, no longer a shadow awaiting leftovers. She sat opposite him, a still and dignified presence. The children no longer hid from her. They would follow her to the garden, watching her coax life from soil. She had discovered a small seed packet in her traveling case, and tiny green shoots now pushed toward the sun. For the first time in 2 years, something new was growing at the ranch. She brought order and strange peace to the house. Baking bread's scent sometimes replaced dust's smell. The children's clothes were always mended, floors always swept. She asked for nothing, demanded nothing, but her very existence began repairing their broken lives' pieces. Elias found himself watching her, studying her movement's graceful efficiency, the unyielding strength in her slight frame. He saw the deep sorrow behind her eyes, sorrow mirroring his own, and felt kinship transcending language and culture. She wasn't Sarah's replacement. Sarah was laughter and sunlight's memory. Mai was survival's testament, quiet promise that hearts could continue. Beating even after shattering, he began, understanding that his home wasn't merely his grief's monument. It could be sanctuary. For hers too. The return of Silas, the sky began curdling one Tuesday afternoon, brilliant blue bruising with purple and gray shades. Storm approached. Air grew thick and heavy, charged with unspoken menace. On this afternoon, Elias saw the rider on the horizon. He knew before the figure was close enough to recognize. It was Silas. He came not as tradesman this time, but as collector. Elias stood on the porch, his body a rigid line of defiance. He sent the children inside with sharp, low command. Mai came to the doorway behind him, trowel still in hand. Her face was pale, but her eyes fearless. Silas reined his horse, gaze sweeping the ranch with owner's arrogance. He noted the tended garden, clean porch, the woman standing behind Elias. A slow, greasy smile spread across his features. "Well, look at you, Elias," he drawled, dismounting. "Looks like you've put my property to good use." Polished her up real nice. He stepped toward the porch, eyes fixed on Mai. "Time to collect my investment. Got a buyer in Carson City, willing to pay premium for one so domesticated." The word property struck Elias like physical blow. Cold, clarifying rage, emotion he hadn't felt in years, surged through him, burning away his grief's fog, leaving terrible, simple clarity. This was his home. These were his people. "She's not for sale," Elias said, his voice a low growl. Silas laughed, short, ugly sound. "She was never yours to keep, widower. Just a loan. Now step aside." He moved to push past Elias, hand reaching for Mai. What happened next wasn't thought but instinct. The protector, dormant so long, awoke with savage force. Elias's hand shot out, grabbing Silas's wrist in iron grip. The rancher, the grieving husband, fell away. For a moment the soldier he'd once been stood in his place. The reckoning. The fight was short, brutal, decisive. It wasn't a brawl, it was expulsion. Elias moved with grim efficiency. Every action fueled by 2 years of pent-up sorrow and fierce new need to defend. The horizon's storm broke. First fat raindrops splattering in dust as Silas scrambled back onto his horse, blood trickling from his split lip. Elias stood over him, chest heaving. "This is her home," he roared, words torn from him by wind and rain. "You are not welcome here, not now, not ever," Silas stared, arrogance shattered, replaced by raw animal fear. He saw not broken widower, but man who had found something to live for, and therefore something to kill for. Without another word, he yanked his horse's reins and fled, swallowed by rain sheets. The storm raged all night, washing the world clean. Elias stood on the porch, letting rain soak his shirt, cold water a balm on his bruised knuckles and simmering soul. The violence hadn't felt good, but it had felt necessary, an affirmation, a line drawn in earth not with plow, but with his own hands. When he finally came inside, drenched and weary, he found Mai waiting in the main room. A single lamp cast warm golden glow. The children were asleep, tucked in their beds. On the table she had laid out hot water bowl, clean cloth, and small salve tin. She didn't speak, simply gestured to the chair. Healing touch. He sat and she began cleaning the cuts on his hands, her touch gentle but firm. Her fingers, usually caked with garden soil, were now tending his wounds. In the lamplight's quiet intimacy, he looked at her. Truly looked at her. He saw the scars she carried, not on her skin, but in her spirit's profound stillness. They were both survivors, marked by the world, finding refuge in the shelter they'd built for each other. He had given her a room, and she had given him back his life. She finished her work, her gaze meeting his. There was no fear in her eyes anymore, only deep, abiding gratitude and strength mirroring his own. In that moment, he understood that family wasn't something you were born into. Sometimes it was something you fought for, earned, built from two separate lives' broken pieces. He had lost a wife but found a partner. The children had lost a mother but found a guardian. "Thank you," he whispered. The words raw and unfamiliar. She simply nodded, a small, sad smile touching her lips for the very first time. A fragile, beautiful thing like spring's first blossom, new dawn. The next morning, the world was reborn. Sun rose into sky scrubbed clean and brilliant, its light catching raindrops clinging to every surface, making the ranch glitter as if strewn with diamonds. Air smelled of wet earth and new beginnings. Elias walked to the garden. The storm hadn't harmed it, it had nourished it. The small green shoots stood taller, stronger, reaching for light. Caleb and Leah were already there, crouched beside Mai, pointing at a tiny ladybug climbing a leaf. They were no longer silent and watchful. They were engaged, faces alive with simple childish wonder he thought lost forever. Leah looked up, saw him and smiled, a real, unguarded smile. He felt his heart, that tight, knotted thing in his chest, loosen. Mai rose and walked toward him. She stopped and looked at the house, at the children, at the thriving garden, then at him. Her eyes conveyed everything words could not. This was home, safety, peace. Elias looked at the small family before him, the resilient woman who had taught him how to live again, the children whose laughter was slowly returning, the earth patch that was testament to their shared will to survive. Silas had meant for her to be symbol of his ruin, cruel mockery of his loss. But she had become architect of his redemption. She hadn't replaced the love he'd lost. She had shown him his heart was big enough to hold a new one. He had been a man living in a graveyard of his own making. But she had come and planted flowers among the tombstones. He reached out, his hand hovering momentarily before gently resting it on her shoulder, a gesture of solidarity, partnership, profound unspoken love. They stood together watching their children, the quiet cowboy and the woman named Mai, two solitary souls who had found their home not on a map, but in each other. This story is testament to human decency's quiet power and the unexpected places we find salvation. It reminds us that even in the harshest landscapes scarred by cruelty and loss, the most beautiful things can grow. Their journey from strangers bound by cruel transaction to family, forged in mutual respect, shows us how love can be conscious choice, an act of defiance, against a world that seeks to dehumanize us. They didn't just mend a garden, they mended each other, proving that the deepest wounds can be healed not by grand gestures, but by the patient daily work of tending to another's soul.